So we're gathered here on the computer on Zoom, and we're probably on the ancestral land of many different indigenous people. Certainly a bunch of us are on the land of the Ohlone, but people may be on many other parts of California, or even the country, that were originally settled by indigenous people. And we have adopted the custom that's become more widespread on the progressive movement to acknowledge and honor those people who stewarded this land for so many centuries and who were brutally displaced and murdered and mistreated in so many ways by the settlers. Have to put a little asterisk and say that many of the settlers were themselves traumatized and oppressed people who came here out of desperation, but that didn't stop them from inflicting cruelty on others. So we're well aware of that. We're also aware of the history of resistance by the native peoples and by other oppressed folks around the world. And I think we're hoping to be allies to that resistance ourselves in our struggle to maintain the planet. As I was anticipating doing this land acknowledgement, I was thinking there's a kind of an analogy with what's going on with the COP27, you know, and the way that the dominant industrialized nations have treated the other parts of the world, which are mostly indigenous people themselves, you know, and have stolen their resources and deprived them of their livelihoods in a similar fashion. It's the history of capitalism. And while we're on the general subject of capitalism, I want to follow the tradition that the Showing Up for Racial Justice folks have adopted of doing labor acknowledgement as well, particularly acknowledging the centuries of unpaid labor by people who were stolen from Africa and enslaved in this country. And I would also add the underpaid labor of so many people who've been employed or barely employed or unemployed under the capitalist system. And resistance is afoot in those worlds as well. So thanks to all our ancestors and contemporaries who are fighting against injustice, and may we take up a stance beside them.
Thanks, Margaret. Well, that's a good invocation as we take up the whole subject of the state of California's climate policy. As everybody here probably knows, every 5 years, California reviews its climate roadmap, otherwise known as the scoping plan. And I think we can see a draft of that, or the final version of that scoping plan, in what, about a week's time. We have some great speakers today who have been very intimately involved with wrestling with the drafting process. And I'm not going to go into much more detail. They're certainly far more knowledgeable, far more granular with all of it than I would ever hope to be. Let me just give quick introductions before we get into the meat of it. We are very honored today to have Matt Holmes, a history worker in his own words. I love that. And environmental justice director of Little Manila Rising, which is an environmental justice group based in Stockton. And Matt is really going to tackle one of the biggest problems with the scoping plan, which is its obscene embrace of carbon capture and sequestration, even carbon capture utilization and sequestration, as a primary means of reducing emissions. And as he will tell us, actually, Stockton is a major target area, major ground zero for CCS proposals. So he's going to give us, I think, a pretty eye-opening picture of what's going on very close to us and what's planned to happen across the state. He will be followed by Faraz Rizvi, who is the campaign and policy manager for Asian Pacific Environmental Network. Really lucky to have you today, Faraz. Thank you so much for being here. And I just want to say that, you know, APEN locally has been and statewide has been a real leader in work around just transition. And I am, you know, forever grateful to Vivian Huang of APEN for getting me and others into a room with USW about 10 years ago. That's how long, at least locally, that conversation has been going on. Really pioneering work, and thank you for showing us the way. And then we will hear from, and again, really lucky to have him, Ted Franklin, who is a labor lawyer and participant, actually a leading light in Labor Rise Climate Jobs Action Group. And I want to say also a primary actor with No Coal in Oakland and many other groups. So here we go. Matt, take it away, unmute yourself, and if you need anything from us, let us know.
No, that's good. Thank you. You know, the honor's all mine. I owe Sunflower a lot. I had the privilege of getting my butt chewed out by Janet Johnson a good 4 years ago in all the right meetings. And Janet gave me necessary and timely direction on how I was handling myself at that moment as an EJ leader. So she showed me what a backbone looked like, and I'm trying to live up to that expectation. So honored to be here. And I don't know how eye-opening my description will be, but I will let you guys know how dysfunctional and myopic and uninterested in human suffering the California planning process has been. And then I will gladly hand it over to Faraz, who will explain to you what this is really all about, which is greenwashing the perpetuation of an oil and gas industry that likes making money, storing its garbage in the sky, and externalizing its costs. And hopefully Ted can tell us how we could do this better and have a more humane survivorship through the global climate instability we're all going to go through. And then, obviously I want to, hear where everybody else is at. And so that's a ritual we could do in the chat for the recording, is to find out our geographic distribution. I know it's kind of a Bay Area crowd, but as we all know, there's a couple different Bay Areas, aren't there? And only some Bay Areas will be hit hard by this, and some other Bay Areas will invest in this, and they will be rewarded for their protraction from the consequences of a fossil fuel industry that very much still owns our California Air Resources Board, which is a peculiar entity that I came to know through air monitoring in Richmond, California. So I'll just do a little background on what it means to be a history worker. It's like a less talented and less compelling version of a sex worker. You do something that everybody knows how to do, but you do it over and over again to help the message get home. So a historian writes new things or challenges old things, creates new ideas. I am not a historian. There are enough concepts in the resolved column that are non-controversial that really just need to be publicized and promoted and understood better. So as a history worker, I'm more of a history teacher than a historian. And I started my work in this, my journey on this environmental justice pathway in Richmond, California. I had the privilege to be a national park ranger at Rosie the Riveter World War II Homefront National Historical Park. I ran an outreach program trying to get the city of Richmond to attend its own national park. I had more visitors from London and Ohio than I had from 3rd Street or Main Street or McDonald Avenue. And so I was doing diversity, equity, and inclusion work, trying to get young people of color to understand that they owned the National Park Service and that they paid for these things and that they belonged to them. And so one of these days I was out there doing, I think it was a Michelle Obama get outside and be active activity. And we were riding bikes down the Richmond Greenway when Sims Metal caught on fire. We were riding through clouds of, melting chrome and all sorts of things. And, sort of clueless about these things, I called the governments and said, hey, what were we exposed to? Who can tell me what was in that? And nobody had a satisfactory answer. Bay Area Air District tried to direct me to an inventory that told me what they thought they polluted over the course of the year, but there was really no hyper-local monitoring data for me to provide to my family members. So I learned quickly that in a career where I was advocating for healthy outdoor activity, no one in Richmond could, in good conscience, advocate for healthy outdoor activity in Richmond because they were uninformed about the conditions of the outdoors. And so with that, I started working on my own monitoring work. We put little PM sensors on our belts, and we rode around town and tried to map PM concentrations. And that experience set me up to get involved in the AB 617 process that was supposed to give us more information about local air pollution. And it was at that time where I realized that the emperor wears no clothes in the air monitoring regimes of California, that the stationary regulators of the air districts knew their industries better than they knew their communities. And the Air Resources Board had really brilliant people who had no idea how things worked in the real world. And so in the middle of the AB 617 and the pandemic kerfuffle, my own home community was designated as an AB 617 community here in Stockton. And I started attending meetings, and the local air district wouldn't allow me to join as a community steering committee member, although I already lived in the study area, but just because they knew that I was a troublemaker from Richmond. And so my now boss, Dylan Delvo of Little Manila Rising, he knew that he was being manipulated because he didn't know about the history of air pollution. And he knew that he was being slow dripped information and that they were using his credibility to pull off the AB 617 process. And he wasn't going to stand for that. And so this is a good opportunity for me to tell you why Little Manila is in this work. He wasn't going to stand for that because he's here for revenge. His best friend was killed by air pollution. His best friend was killed by planned pollution and a planned disease known as asthma. His best friend was Dr. Dawn Bohulano Mabalon. She was the nation's preeminent historian of Filipino Americans. She died the day before she was to testify in front of Congress about Filipino representation in the Smithsonian at the age of 46. She also happened to be my graduate advisor at SF State. So she was a remarkable woman, an uncommon intellect, and a truly decolonized person who was taken from us all, but was in particular taken from Stockton, a community that she was trying to uplift and recognize for its national and global significance. And so Dylan, who was one of the community co-hosts of the AB 617 process, said, fine, you won't add this guy, Matt, who seems to know more than I do about you as a resident. I'm going to quit the committee and I'm going to hire him as my outreach specialist, and I'm going to designate him as our delegate. And so through a really contentious fight with the San Joaquin Valley Air Pollution Control District that makes the Bay Area Air District look like the World Health Organization, and that's a bold statement. We got a really contentious settlement in our community emissions reduction planning process. And then I realized right at the end of that CARB really was an absentee landlord in a lot of its policies. I had every single CARB board member join a coalition of steering committee members who wanted to correct our emission reduction plan, but CARB had no power to control the emission reduction plan. They could either approve it or disapprove it. And so they allowed us to be punished by the Air District. They withheld $5 million from our CERP. So we're a city of 320,000 people with a $31 million community emissions reduction plan. By contrast, Shafter has 19,000 people and has a $38 million emission reduction plan. And we're happy for them. And so it was at that point that Dylan and I both looked at each other and said, we got to figure out what's going on at CARB. And that was when there was a call for the AB 32 Environmental Justice Advisory Committee, which is why we're all here. The EJAC, I'm going to start using that pretty frequently, is a statutory requirement for the AB 32 greenhouse gas plan that was passed in 2006. It's a statutory requirement to listen to, but the entire plan itself is developed in something called the climate planning and research domain at the California Air Resources Board. So they write up a massively scientific plan, and then they throw all the details at a small body of non-scientific people for 12 months. And they really just try to big league us and push us over and get us to accept their take on how to address global climate instability. And so on day one, we asked for an extension, which was rejected for all the wrong reasons. But we spent most of the last 18 months talking about carbon capture and sequestration, which is only 3% of the planned emission reductions in this plan. It received a disproportionate amount of attention from the Air Resources Board and a disproportionate amount of discomfort from us as members of the communities where this was being planned. And so the historian in me caught on real quick that there was something was afoot here, that we were focused on this for all the right reasons. And the truth of the matter is it's really the only way for California to continue to underwrite and support the fossil fuel industry that has owned so much of the state for so long. So even though it was only 3%, all 3 of those percent reductions will have to happen in disadvantaged and overburdened communities, which in many interpretations is a crime. And even though, well, I guess I should back up a little bit to give you a sense of how protracted the planners at CARB are from the way things work in the real world. There's not a single project that could be proposed in California that could come into play during the performance period of this 2022 scoping plan. So they wrote a plan and they projected emissions reduction or CO2 capture starting this year, even though not a single project would be shovel ready for the next 5 years. And so these are desk engineers who have never built anything in the real world, but it was easy to put things in a spreadsheet and look like you were getting stuff done. And so we obviously recommended that things that can't happen during this plan not be included in this plan. And you would have thought we said, that trees are bad for the world. But I think the focus on this engineered carbon removal system really revealed the comfort of, or the preference of the government to rely on an industrial solution rather than the long, hard work that Ted's going to talk about. And the long, hard work that indigenous people managed the state with for 12,000 years by living in balance with the systems that do carbon removal naturally. And so I managed to take up a lot of space on this conversation because of projects proposed in my area. And I happen to know something about those projects because the polluting industries that send my residents to a grave at least had the temerity to call me and talk to me about it. They knew that I deserved to know about their proposals more than either the California Air Resources Board or US EPA Region 9 do, right? None of the public agencies whose job it is to protect us have any sort of apparatus or intention of notifying communities in a meaningful way that they're planning to subsidize pollution sources in their communities. And so, but before even the EJAC process started, we were made aware of a couple of different proposals, one to use biomass and one to use ethanol and to store it under the delta behind us. To which I said, hey, what happens if it leaks? And I thought it was like a stupid question that they would all have a really good answer for and that they would disregard. But they didn't. Nobody ever asked. They all believed in the permit. They said it's a rigorous 200-part permit. It's much more rigorous than other permits. So why would it leak? And I said, well, have you met the oil and gas industry? They can't hold on to saline injection fluid or gaseous methane. Why would they be able to hold on to supercritical CO2 that boils in an Earth atmosphere? And I'm sitting there going, I'm a failed substitute teacher, and this guy works for a national research institution, and he hasn't asked these questions. And so, it turns out dumb questions are still really necessary in this whole process. And to the credit of this was Lawrence Livermore Lab and the Department of Energy, they've now finally funded a surface transport model and a leakage study for the Delta. Because prior to this question, all of the research on carbon capture injection sites had been predicated on being under brownfields or impaired landscapes. But that genre of study and understanding was just disregarded when California brought it in and said, hey, we're going to fund this with our low carbon fuel standard because it'll help us, get an application that says it's removing this much carbon, and then we'll be able to tell the governor that we hit his goals by 2045. Whether or not any of it stays in the ground, they didn't really seem to care. So that sort of leads me to segue into what kind of projects we're looking at. But I guess before I get there, I should back up a little bit and say that California and the feds have a little bit of cover in that there are some scenarios where carbon capture may be a good idea. And, we've heard about hard to decarbonize cement glass and steel production. If you look behind me, there's no climate resilient strategy for Stockton over here without mountains and mountains of cement and concrete. So I would be in favor of understanding that. But that's not really how the real world works. We have 14 applications for carbon capture injection permits, and not one of them is for cement, glass, or steel. They are all for existing negative impact, bad neighbor industries like biomass, ethanol, and traditional oil and gas industries. And so the whole pretense for carbon capture being included in the scoping plan isn't going to play out in the real world unless people really watchdog these diligently. So I want to share a map real quick, just to sort of punctuate. And this is from the Center for Biological Diversity, and they've been doing some real work on tracking the injection permits because EPA still doesn't have a reliable, here, I'm gonna try, can you guys see my full screen? So you guys recognize California, and this is what poverty looks like, right? The Central Valley of California is bigger than a bunch of countries in Europe and most states in the East Coast. It's the greatest wealth creating region in agriculture in all of human history. It's also the home to the most poverty impacted households in all of North America. So we're the poorest folks making the most money. And we basically exist as a colony of the west side of California, the first world, which, you know, I share that with you all knowing that you understand that, and that's not a dig at you. But the state of California and the federal government fully plan to reinvest in polluting industries in this already urban overburdened landscape. And in particular, you know, they're looking at either continuing existing pollution sources like the biomass facility in my backyard, or resurrecting closed biomass facilities like the one down in Mendota, or expanding and continuing the pollution of an ethanol plant that I'm aware of. So basically, we're inventing pollution just to prove that we can capture it. And this has already been going on through the low carbon fuel standard and California's dairy industry. California incentives have created dairies that are generating milk and cheese that no market has demanded. So we're catching cow farts and cow burps and piles of methane manure just to capture California incentives. We're diverting scarce water into their bellies, and we're delivering toxic runoff into waters that impairs the waterways all the way through California, just so that the California Air Resources Board can say that its low carbon fuel standard is reducing the carbon intensity of that industry. And so I think the dairies and the types of projects that they're looking to incentivize here in California have proven a really sad thing about the California Air Resources Board, which is when they decided to make it the greenhouse gas czar, they took a major and valuable public health entity and turned it into some kind of tech bro innovation hub, where they're out looking for, you know, new and innovative ways to be to reduce carbon intensity, and that has run ahead of their original mission to protect communities like ours from overburdening the pollution. So, you know, I've thrown a lot at you. And I'd be happy to take questions either about what the agency's response has been or about some of the projects that we've seen come down the pipeline. I'll just wrap up by saying that the justification for CCS in the rare and narrow categories hasn't materialized in any significant way. This policy has been used and manipulated by traditional industries to continue, expand, or resurrect pollution in overburdened communities. And that feels like a crime, both under California law and under federal law. So I'll stop sharing, but I can drop this link to the map in here, since the Center for Biological Diversity is doing a better job of tracking new projects than the regulators who we employ to protect us. Yeah, lots of magical thinking, Janet. I saw that, and I can't see all the other comments, but I will stop sharing to see if I can see some faces. And I don't know if there are any questions about this. I'll say that we've been in a draft scoping plan process for 18 months, and we've provided critical feedback on this strategy repeatedly, and we see it enduring all of that criticism. Unfortunately, the statutory requirement to consult with the EJAC doesn't mean they have to listen to the EJAC. But I think we've also made really valid points, like the risk to surface waters here in the Delta was something nobody had a good answer for, and it was quite embarrassing for both of the agencies, which allowed us to force a CCS symposium to be held out here in Stockton to understand those issues. But at the end of the day, we're still fighting this, and we're gonna have to fight this on a project by project basis, because each project, really each landscape is so totally unique. There's a so-called area of review in the Class 6 injection permit that assumes that when you squirt something underground, that it stays directly underneath you. And I don't know if you guys have ever looked at rocks, but they're not exactly squares and rectangles. And so plume migration is a huge question mark and has a really sort of loose, at best, monitoring strategy for monitoring the migration of the CO2 plume underground. And then the other thing I forgot, Shoshana, you reminded me of this earlier. These communities have been chosen because they have world-class geology. And the only reason they know anything about our geology is that these were the communities that were politically vulnerable enough for oil and gas exploration for the last 150 years, right? Like, we don't know shit about the geology underneath Montecito as far as storing CCS, because they're just not going to let it happen. And so when they said the Delta has world-class geology, we had to remind them that we have 3,700 abandoned wells whose locations are unknown. And so we're going to have these people squirting carbon into reservoirs underground, more than likely just to have it escape immediately right back up an abandoned well that the former Dogger, now Cal Gym, has no idea where it is. And so I think there's a number of opportunities in the permitting process for communities to fight specific projects. But back to the land acknowledgement and the labor acknowledgement, that's going to mean that a bunch of us here are going to have to do our government's job for it. Otherwise, these things are going to really threaten human communities. For example, we've had significant explosions in Mississippi that hospitalized lots of people. CARB and federal risk management assume that a breach in a pipe points straight up. But if it points out sideways, your exclusion zone totally changes. And we're talking about high pressure stuff, ridiculously high pressure stuff. Injection site monitoring and advanced early warning systems for communities remain almost entirely underdeveloped. And so we're trying to work with other national labs to develop monitoring strategies without that appearing to be an endorsement. It's really difficult to engage on an issue and learn on an issue and not be used by the research entities and the regulatory entities as examples of supporting community members. And so threading that needle has been a challenge for me. I'll also say that, this is in my backyard, and I have a hard time not engaging with this issue. I mean, I think it would be easier if somebody wasn't targeting my community and got their, was funded to fight this. But I have to engage with this. And so I also have to ask my allies in the environmental justice community to understand that when I engage with these actors and these governments, it's both as a corrective for them and a protection for myself. But I'll reiterate again, nothing I do on this should be construed as an endorsement. So helping them to do a leakage study for the Delta behind me doesn't mean I want them to bury anything there. I want them to convince everybody that there's zero risk, because they're not going to find zero risk. And when they do find a risk, I can still point to it and say, this is the largest estuary on the west coast of North and South America, and every marine mammal from Puget Sound to Baja California depends on it. And the human and non-human ecology of the entire Bay Area in California depends on these waters, which is not to say we've ever managed it in that way. But the worst case scenario of leakage into this estuary is a disaster, and it bodes huge legal challenges under Marine Mammal Act, Migratory Bird Act, Clean Water Act, all of the above. So seems like it might be easier to pay a whole lot of people to do the long, hard work of restoring our environment and training people for a more just future.
There you go.
But sometimes people are messy. Engineers like pipes. So I can keep going. I have tons more. This is like therapy.
Matt, you're coming back. You're coming back.
Okay.
Wow, this is a master class. Thank you so much. And for us, he's a very hard act to follow, I realize. But unfortunately, you got to do it. Everybody, please hold your questions until all of our speakers have presented. And, you know, we tend to be we get into it here in these meetings. We can always extend. If you have the stamina, we can just keep this meeting going. Thanks so much, Matt. And we're going to turn now to Faraz.
Thank you, Shoshana. And I always love the passion and energy that Matt brings. It's really just one of a kind. And it's really wonderful to have a voice that's passionate on the EJAC. So I'm going to be talking about and lifting up some of the threads that Matt already shared. I do have a presentation that I would like to show you. To begin with, I'll just kind of go into this. Can everyone see my screen?
Not quite yet. There you go.
Okay, perfect. So I wanted to talk about the petroleum phase out plan, which is a key ask that the Center for CEJA and APEN and other actors have joined in to ask the board for. And I wanted to kind of get into how this really plays into just transition framework that we've really been pushing for the last few years. And to start with, this is just one of many asks that we've really pushed and championed within the scoping plan process, and some that we've won. So let's get into that. So for starters, what is the scoping plan? Obviously, we already ran through some of it, including the EJAC, but just for clarity's sake, the scoping plan is just a big document that lays out California's strategy for meeting the reduction targets under state law. It happens every 5 years. And this is a really critical component of really mapping out what the state's emissions pathways are going to look like up until 2045. Right now, what we have is a scoping plan, a draft scoping plan that has a really wide scope, including electric sector targets, transportation targets, natural gas targets, electricity sector targets. And so it would be its own presentation to really get into the weeds of those, but just wanted to start with saying that the scoping plan is really a massive undertaking. And what we're going to be looking at right now is just some of the CARB modeling around the oil demand and oil refineries in particular. And I noticed that in the chat, some folks were speaking about how they're from Richmond, which is, of course, one of the regions in the state that's really impacted by oil refineries, and one where APEN has really championed organizing and advocacy for its tenure. So right now in the CARB modeling, what we're seeing is that the draft scoping plan assumes an 83% decline in refinery emissions due to declining in-state oil demand. So basically, because of the existing ACF rule and as well as the executive orders by the governor and a number of other things, the scoping plan is assuming that in-state oil demand is going to drop by 83%. And there's a footnote on page 83 of the scoping plan, which says that this doesn't really assume any need, that this doesn't assume any numbers around exports. And we'll touch on that a little bit. But essentially, while this is reported in the draft scoping plan, CARB really has no mechanism to ensure that these are actual real reductions and no plan to address what this means for communities, workers, state agencies, and everyone that is impacted by oil refineries, including workers. And so what we've put forward is the necessity of a phase-out plan that is going to be including workers, agencies, communities. And I want to talk a little bit about why we need a phase-out plan. So without a coordinated phase-out plan, oil companies like Chevron will declare bankruptcy and just leave refineries as stranded assets. We know that this is the game plan that they're going to push. They're going to push that they keep the refineries on as long as they can, as long as they're profitable. But the reality is that refineries have seen diminishing profits for decades, and many of these are very old. And so we don't expect them to, as we move away from oil, to really pack them up and do the work that's necessary to protect communities. So the reality is that this is going to leave environmental justice communities on the hook for billions in toxic cleanups, billions in municipalities struggling to make up lost revenue, tax revenue. In cities like Richmond, the refineries are a huge source of the tax base that funds the city. So the reality is that without a planned supply side phase out, we're going to have an unplanned one. That's just the reality. And we know that that's what they're planning. So Matt talked about carbon capture and sequestration. And I wanted to talk about this too, specifically on the oil refinery sector. So right now in the draft scoping plan, the CARB is expecting to have 70 carbon capture technology on 70% of refinery operations. This does not acknowledge the fact that by 2045, 80% of the state refineries will be obsolete, and that this infrastructure itself will cost billions to build and require way more energy than they're expecting within the scoping plan itself. So with carbon capture, what we're seeing is that this adding carbon capture to refineries does not make any sense. And at the symposium, the CCS symposium that was convened by CARB, the head of FECM at the DOE, Jennifer Wilcox, said as much, that CCS on refineries makes no sense. And I don't want to get into too much of the technicality. I can a little if there are any questions around it, but the reality is that by putting forward carbon capture on 70% of operations, at the same time that there's a huge expectation for oil refinery demand to drop, is locking in carbon capture technology and refineries for the next 100 years. So this is really disastrous to communities that have been really impacted by pollution, that have really been impacted by health impacts, and have lived under the shadow of these refineries for hundreds of years now, or for 100 years now. So that brings me to the next point, which is the just transition piece of it. We are pushing forward that it is the board's responsibility to ensure that the massive projected decline is coordinated and responsible, and that CARB should work with labor unions, environmental justice advocates, and all of the above to make sure that there's a supply side phase down that is looking at these 2045 in-state demands, in the decline in in-state demands, and making sure that this doesn't result in refineries being just stranded assets that are left for communities left with billions of dollars in remediation, and that there is a cleanup, that there is a way forward that includes communities and workers. The other side of it is that the expectations by CARB show that there's going to be a decline in demand for in-state. That does not account for the fact that there could be oil exports. And based on the data that we have seen, over 25% of existing gasoline and diesel refined is currently for export.
Right.
And this is a growing issue, not just in California, but nationally. So as the different CARB rulemakings drive down in-state demand, we have to make sure that these oil refineries don't make up that demand by increasing exports that maintains the same level of oil refinery emissions. Without looking at this key element of it, we're going to be leaving out a really key phase of how we can make sure that the emissions reductions from this reduced in-state demand is real. And so this brings to the EJAC recommendation. And so what we've been calling for is a process that's convened by Cal EPA, which is an interagency plan that includes unions, workers, community members, city officials, and everybody. Because as we've seen in the draft scoping plan, and we've seen in other CARB rulemakings, it's clear that the movement away from fossil fuels is currently ongoing, that's a reality. And at some point, CARB needs to step up and say that we need to protect communities when it comes to this ongoing process, and that without looking at communities like Richmond or Wilmington or Long Beach that have lived in the shadow of these refineries for the last century, and that they have been critical for their workers. That, for example, the Marathon refinery that was idled about during the pandemic, 1 in every 8 people, or 8 people, was supported by every one of those jobs. So we need to make sure that we're creating a high road pathway that includes high road union jobs, that also includes greening our infrastructure and keeping our communities at the forefront of it. And so that will bring me to the end of the presentation. But I just want to, and I know that's much quicker than Matt's wonderful presentation. So I'll leave some time for questions, but just wanted to end on the note that this is a statewide process that's really critical to making sure that as we move forward into the implementation of the scoping plan, that environmental justice communities own and co-design this process, that this isn't something that's convened without our help, that this is not something that is led by agencies and by fossil fuel execs themselves, because we've seen this time and time again, where we have this potential and we have draft language, but when it comes to implementation, we're completely left out of the room. We've made some significant strides in the scoping plan, and while it's not perfect, but we have been able to push on some different elements, including like the electric sector, VMT targets. And we really want to continue to push forward a model of co-governance that includes not just keeping our voices at the table so that we can just register some opposition when it matters, but actual meaningful co-governance. And I think a phase-out plan is going to be one of the key steps to make sure that the very communities that are going to be impacted by this movement away from fossil fuels, especially oil refineries, are kept within a plan that have ownership over what their communities look like in the aftermath of that. So I'll leave it there and I'll turn it over to Shoshana, but if there are any questions, I think we're going to be doing that afterward.
Since you've been so wonderfully concise, I wonder if I could just sneak in a question and then we can circle back with more questions after Ted has presented. But you did EJAC, that is, which has just done amazing work. And I know how frustrating the whole process probably has been. You've really hung in there in spite of that and actually won some pretty significant concessions from CARB. That said, you have introduced the desirability of, starting to talk about refinery phase out now, but how does it, when is it going to stop being merely talk and actually turn into a timeline and real interagency work? What do you think about that? Where are we right now?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think what we're really looking at now is that we've been working on developing language, and we're expecting the draft scoping plan, or the final version of the scoping plan, to come out tomorrow, sometime within the next week, but I believe the expectation is tomorrow at some point. And so we're looking at what the language within the final scoping plan is going to be. When we had the EJAC CARB meeting on September 1st, board gave clear direction to staff to include this phase out within the plan. Right. So we fully expect it to be there. And while we've been doing some inside-outside organizing to make sure that we're holding the line and making sure that the language that we want gets in, at the end of the day, it's really going to be in the implementation phase. We've had some meetings with the new head of the Cali PA, Yana Garcia, who's a former CBE attorney as well, who's wonderful and is a friend of environmental justice. And so our meeting with Yana was really powerful in that she's really fully looking forward to co-designing these processes. I think what we're really looking at is making sure that once the plan is finalized, whether the language we want there is not, that Cal EPA can look forward to convening and leading this process. And I think that's going to happen regardless of whether CARB steps up to the plate or not. And that's the organizing that we're going to have to continue to do.
And I just have one real brief wrinkle to add to that, which is that, you know, the plan we responded to was cooked up in secret, you know, by industry and by staff for 5 years, and then thrown at us and said, respond to this, like it's a Jackson Pollock opinion or something. And so we spent 18 months convincing them that we aren't leftist kooks that want to live in the Stone Age, and by giving them practical solutions and doing better research than frankly had been done. And I think on the first, we really at least heard some overtures and hopefully built some trust with leadership, and requested to continue the role of the Environmental Justice Advisory Committee and the other committees that need to inform each of the scenarios. And the chair acknowledged that and requested to continue the Environmental Justice Advisory Committee, because we can plan and redesign this thing all the time. You only have to replan it at the latest every 5 years. So it is malleable throughout the entire process. So that's kind of what we're working on right now, is to get constant traction on this plan to keep improving it. And so that, I think that's a way to get the phase out, to give it the details we need. Because if we wait 5 years for WISPA to write it with the oil and gas division at CARB, then we're going to be starting at square one again. So
Yep. Okay. Ted, this is a good time for you to jump in. Think you're muted, and yeah, there. Please unmute.
I'm clicking.
There you go. All right.
So yeah, I am really incredibly grateful to the people who have served on EJAC to fight this this plan, and to fight to try to make a better plan. It's, you know, I know how frustrating it's been, but I'm a Johnny come lately to this struggle at CARB, though not to the labor movement or the climate movement. And I came in here basically fairly recently, becoming aware of what was happening in terms of the struggle over the scoping plan and how important it is in terms of defining California policy. It's going to be referred to by legislators and the administration as we move forward, and as being sort of the guiding document. And for it to be as polluted as it is with ideas coming from the fossil fuel industry is quite frightening. And since I retired from being a union lawyer in 2015, I've been seeking ways to bring the two movements, the labor movement and the climate movement, together. And it hasn't been easy going. I think, you know, so many of you here will remember what happened in Richmond a few years ago, pretty recently actually, when there was a struggle over shutting down the coal operation on the wharf in Richmond. And you know, there was a one very vivid confrontation that I remember, where there were 100 people on one side and 100 people on the other side, you know, gathered outside of the city hall, and it was union people who had been brought out to stand up for holding on to the jobs at shoveling coal, and the environmental justice community, climate justice community on the other side, you know, trying to put an end to this polluting fossil fuel coming through Richmond. And it was a very heart-wrenching thing for me, because I am a member of both movements. And I can't think of anything that's more critical in our fight against climate change than breaking down this divide. We know that the jobs versus climate frame is wrong. And without the support of unions and rank and file workers, the climate movement will not have the power to bring about the just transition that we're all dreaming of. And People's historian Jeremy Brecker, who was one of the founders of Labor Network for Sustainability, wrote a few years ago, "There are not two groups of people, environmentalists and workers. We all need a livelihood. We all need a livable planet to live on. And if we don't address both, we'll starve together while we're waiting to fry together." So a few months ago, a small group of us who consider ourselves climate labor activists became painfully aware that the process around California's scoping plan was moving along without significant input from labor. The building trades, which represent about 20% of California's organized workforce, have been vocal and involved, but they have supported the agenda of the oil and gas industries. And the 80% of California organized labor that's not in the building trades has been relatively quiet as CARB has been devising the plans for the energy transition. Yet these plans are going to affect every one of California's 20 million workers, union and non-union. It's going to reshape as we go through this environmental change, this change in our energy sources. It's going to reshape the entire economy of this entire society. And we were alarmed to discover that the draft scoping plan that CARB staff had cooked up was lacking any sense of this. It focused on technological fixes, some good, but others that were in the realm, as some folks have said, of magical thinking and outright deception, such as the carbon capture and storage. I mean, I was surprised to see that a slideshow in which it was said that there was going to be, they were going to be able to capture 70% of the emissions from refineries. 90% at each stack, and because you can't get every stack or something like that, it would be 70% of the emissions. This craziness, a false solution, but it's where a lot of the effort is going to go from the fossil fuel industry into trying to keep as much of the green transition budget going into their coffers as possible. And the scoping plan the scoping document lacked any plan to take care of workers and communities who would lose their jobs and resources in the energy transition. So we participated in June by drafting a letter calling on CARB to modify the draft scoping plan to incorporate what we call the California Climate Jobs Plan. Over 20 unions have endorsed this plan in the past year and a half. And we put together a letter that over a 36, we were running up against a tight deadline, and we had 36 hours to gather signatures. We got 138 trade unionists, and frankly, we could have had thousands if we'd had the time. Many service employees, teachers, nurses, and some even from building trades. So what is this California Climate Jobs Plan? What is that term referring to? And in the midst of the pandemic, a group of unions, as Faraz mentioned, the California Federation of Teachers, ASME Local 3299, and the United Steelworkers, Local 675 down in LA, which represents refinery workers in Southern California, commissioned a team of economists to draft a program for economic recovery and clean energy transition. And they turned to Robert Pollin, a distinguished economist at the Political Economy Research Institute at the University of Massachusetts in Amherst. And Pollin's team was asked to produce a comprehensive analysis of what it would actually look like to try to meet the climate goals that are enshrined in California law. Not from the technological standpoint and not from the regulatory standpoint, but from the standpoint of how you take care of the social and economic impacts of changing the economy in such fundamental ways. So instead of giving credence to the climate versus jobs antagonism, the team's charter was to create a plan that was not a plan for austerity, but a jobs plan, a plan that could attract broad union support for climate action and for a phase out of the fossil fuel industry. So the result of this effort was a 178-page report that examines the California economy sector by sector. The report explores real opportunities for employment, for building a green economy, and taking care of the 112,000 workers who are directly dependent on the fossil fuel industry. And the plan would create 1 million jobs a year while providing funds for transition for the communities that are affected and workers displaced. So they estimated that in doing all their calculations, achieving California's 2030 goal, along with upgrading the state's infrastructure and agricultural economy, would require $138 billion per year in combined investments in clean energy, manufacturing, and displaced worker relief programs. Remarkably, this is only like 3.8% of California's GDP, of California's total economy. A reasonable investment, you would think, to avoid a California on fire and a world on fire. And assuming that the public and private sectors split the total equally, it would require $70 billion per year of public funding, state and federal. So, I won't go into, there are a lot of details in it. It's 178 pages, fine print, lots of work went into it. But what happened next is that as we got this letter on file and we went and participated in the day in June when CARB held a hearing on its draft plan, and many of the folks from the EJ community spoke on that day. We spoke on behalf of the labor. We tried to inject a voice of labor that was not aligned with the fossil fuel industry. And coming from that, we've become the Labor Rise Climate Jobs Action Group, actually affiliated with Labor Rise for Climate Jobs, Justice, and Peace, which is an organization that came out of the 2018 march in San Francisco. And we are organized around the idea that no climate program should be, every climate program has to be a jobs program, and every jobs program has to be a climate program from here on. And the question we now face is, where do we go from here? How do we organize? How do we bring more labor people, more union folks into the process and become aligned with the climate justice community and the environmental justice community as the work goes forward in the next year? And, the final draft we just heard is it might be out tomorrow. We hope that the report will reflect some of the contributions of the Environmental Justice Advisory Committee, but we're not really optimistic that CARB staff really took a look at the pollen report. And I think, so the official plan is to kick the can down the road, but that means we need to run down the road and get ready for the next year's battles. And I understand that there's going to be the CARB chairperson, Leanne Randolph, directed CARB staff to include in the final draft of this scoping plan a call for Governor Newsom to convene an interagency working group next year to deal with some of the phase out issues overlooked by the scoping plan. Well, we certainly regard ours as part of those realities that have been overlooked. And this process would involve bringing in the Labor and Workforce Development Agency, not just an Air Resources Board, in analyzing how to move forward. So that's where we are. I'm going to put, I'll drop some links into the chat so you can find out more about the work that we're doing as the Labor Rise Climate Jobs Action Group. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I mean, such an integral piece. And in fact, community members are workers. Workers are community members. And we have really got to see, a merging of what have been, portrayed as and what have in fact been seen, have been in fact competing interests. They are one interest. At least I like to think. Martha, you had a question earlier about SB 1314, and as somebody who is active in labor climate issues, I wonder also if you feel up to making a few general comments.
Sure. Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Sounds like yes.
Yes.
Great. Yeah. I'm actually the co-chair of the SEIU 10-to-1 Climate Justice Committee, and our local was an early supporter of the California Climate Jobs Plan and is officially in the statewide coalition to get this plan implemented. However, there's really, as far as I can tell, no plan yet for rank and file organizing, and the way how to proceed is the big question. So in our union, we got wind of two bills, 1137 and 1314, the setback legislation and the carbon capture, the opposition to carbon capture for enhanced oil recovery. We have worked to get support for these bills, and lo and behold, they passed and the governor signed them. I'm wondering if our speakers could comment on those bills and the significance of them passing, their if they're going to work at all, and the efforts to organize already against them. Thank you.
I can comment more on 1314 because we were involved in that from the very beginning. For some reason, we had to point out that it would be really weird to use climate portfolio dollars to dig up more oil. But that's exactly what was going to happen with some of these carbon intensity dollars that come out of the low carbon fuel standard. So they were absolutely going to squirt sequestered CO2 down one pipe to push oil up another pipe. And we spent about half a year, and so did the chief of staff or the speaker of the assembly. We had to spend the whole year fighting what should have given everyone cognitive dissonance, digging up more oil with climate resilience dollars. So it was an absurd thing that could only happen in like a Dr. Seuss state like California. We were really thrilled when it was passed and it was embraced, and we banned enhanced oil recovery with CCS. It was lumped in with a bunch of climate bills, including 905. And some of that looks like it may have opened the doorway for some carbon projects. But the fact that it also came along with the setbacks, which has been like a 15-year fight. And I don't know if everybody knows that there are like oil derricks in the middle of kickball fields down in Wilmington, and that they'll drill for oil and gas next to your toilet. And it was just really an absurd California that was going on there with setbacks, and building trades fought tooth and nail over that because it's a good paying job that's really easy, and they know how to keep running it over and over again. So getting those setbacks was a big deal. There was a big celebration yesterday for the orgs that have worked on that for a decade and a half. And banning enhanced oil recovery was a very big deal. And I think the groups that help get both of those passed will be watchdogging the implementation of them and ensuring that they're pursued. I'll tell you, CalGym is an agency in trouble, right? Like, I mean, they had to change their name first because nobody believed in Dogger anymore. But CalGym's been leaking methane, and they don't know what to do when they find it. They need somebody like CCEJN to go out and get on a bullhorn and warn the school downwind of a leaking methane well. So I think both of the bills are great, and they both illustrate how unpaid labor from the advocacy sector are the only thing keeping California accountable and enforcing California policy.
Wow.
Yeah, it was crazy. And I mean, like, you can waste my time, but the chief of staff for the Speaker of the Assembly is a very busy woman. And the fact that she had to answer a single goddamn email about digging up more oil with sequestered carbon should make everybody just livid. I mean, there's so many things that we could have been working on. So, I mean, I'm still sort of in the, oh my God, we got through that and we passed it phase. But I'm sure there will be wrinkles that I find distasteful over the coming year about who finds a way around it. There are there are issues with the setbacks about how old was the well and is it still producing? So there may need to be legislation to tighten up the clock on things that existed before this bill was passed. But before I stop talking, are there any more questions about 1314 and 1137? 1137. Ted brought up the call by the chair for an interagency working group on a phase out. She also called for an interagency working group on natural and working lands. CARB really artificially suppressed the benefits of nature and also presumes to conflate agribusiness, like with this river behind me. And CARB doesn't have the core competency to evaluate either natural or working lands, and issued a projection that was just a suppressed sequestration capacity, and which was a bummer because If we're going to give billions of dollars to people to continue with industry, can you imagine what billions of dollars would do for the restoration of our forests and our communities, our urban greening programs, the connective trails, riverways, and parkways that bring our lives together? And they intentionally masked the co-benefits, which is really frustrating because I planted trees in Richmond for 5 years and I used to have hair, but I pulled it out while trying to do all of the co-benefit calculations that CARB forces CAL FIRE to put on every single tree you plant. Because you can plant a trident maple, right? And it's worth this much carbon. But if you plant it to the south and west of a house, it shades that house during a hot day and keeps the air conditioner from coming on. And it drops the leaves in the winter and doesn't keep the house cool and allows the house to absorb sun. But you have to calculate the azimuth, the sweep of the shadow of a tree to fully understand the co-benefits of that tree. The scoping plan pretends that those benefits don't exist. They also don't calculate the co-benefits of my current job training program where I'm hiring formerly incarcerated people to plant and maintain trees in their own neighborhood. People who are on the cusp of living in the ditch in the river with the 7,000 homeless residents in my community who now have jobs and can pay their rent and are not a burden on the healthcare system or the carceral system. So all these co-benefits don't exist. And so the artificial suppression of investing in the land and the people around it really points to the fact that this is not a transformational plan yet. It's still very much a science nerd plan that doesn't reflect to the real world. And so we recommended an interagency working group and to delegate that plan to the Natural Resources Agency, which at least has some history of evaluating those. And then there's also a bill that's been created to develop an interagency working group to bring together the Natural Resources Agency 30 by 30 plan and the CARB scoping plan. That advocates had to point out the state agencies are like making up their own plans as if they live in a closet and they're planning at cross purposes is really, it's really frustrating. And it took advocates on calls like this to remind them that all these plans were happening at the same time. The last thing I'll say is we have our first assistant secretary for environmental justice and equity in the Natural Resources Agency. And he had to call the first meeting of justice chairs in all the different agencies and bureaus. They had never met. So people that were working on equity and environmental justice had never compared notes from Department of Water Resources to Tribal Affairs, you name it. So they've been, they were check the box rituals, and hopefully now we can get them into an integrated planning process. And we're just going to make a ton of hay out of those co-benefits, because we all know investing in people is a good idea. 36 ounces of brain tissue is the most powerful natural resource we have.
Faraz, do you have anything to add to that? I'm not sure that I can really formulate a particularly clear question right now, but I'm sitting here and I'm obsessing again about carbon sequestration. And I think about refineries and what they co-emit with carbon dioxide, all the toxic pollutants, an equivalent amount of toxic pollutants that come out of those stacks. Nobody is talking about capturing that, reducing that in any way, right?
Yep,
Where are
absolutely.
we?
Absolutely. And this is really one of the key issues with refinery CCS is that, CCS in general is a scam. If you look at all the pilot projects all over the world, they have not even come close to capturing what they on paper should have, according to the engineers. But in particular on oil refineries, there are so many point sources of emissions. It's such complex technology that for getting CCS on 70% of refinery operations, it's not realistic. The technology to do that literally does not exist. We're talking about steam methane reformers, we're talking about cat crackers, we're talking about so many different forms of technology. And the reality is that the oil refineries in California are a century old. They are not new. And so there have been some comparisons about CCS technology in Germany, but that infrastructure was built not that long ago compared to the refineries that we're dealing with here. And so they're outdated, they're a century old. And they also, we're seeing that to run CCS on these oil refineries, the amount of energy that would be needed would be close to a third of California's entire electric sector needs, our entire yearly output. And so the amount of emissions that would be generated just from running CCS operations on refineries and CCS operations in general will significantly increase net emissions overall. This is not even talking about the co-pollutants that come with refineries, from NOx to PM to all the other ugly stuff that comes out of it. So the reality is that the existing draft plan that includes CCS on refineries, and that just includes such a over reliance on CCS, is a scam to keep business as usual going without actually reducing emissions. But on paper, everything looks like it's balanced out. The CARB is looking at this like a math problem. That, okay, if we take out this much while putting some here, this is how it'll all balance out, and we're going to be completely compliant with the AB 32 guidelines, and that's just not a realistic assessment in terms of actually approaching the real world problems. And this is why I think environmental justice as a framework has been so valuable here, is that for environmental justice communities and for environmental justice as a whole, we don't look at the impacts of climate change and industrial pollution as abstracts. They are concrete, they're concrete impacts of real world infrastructure that we build and live around. It's part of our built environment, and our built environment has it has, like everything in our society, a racist structure to it. And so, really putting that power back into the people is really what we're trying to do here, especially in these processes that are so heavily, captured by, the oil industry. So where we're at right now with CARB and I think Matt's example of the suppression of the natural working lands is so crucial, because they're expecting such a high volume. I don't know the number off the top of my head of MMT, like million metric tons of CO2 capture by 2045, or even by 2030. But that level of CCS just will not, they can't deploy that much CCS. So we're already behind the ball. And there is a huge opportunity cost here. We're investing billions of dollars in continuing to impact and pollute environmental justice communities in places that have borne the brunt for the last century of our oil addiction, and that we're going to continue to do so. And that's by relying on these scams. That's what we're telling these environmental justice communities, that we know you've dealt with it for so long and you're going to continue to deal with it.
Yeah, Faraz, I just wanted to add, you bring up a really good point. Without suppressing the benefits of the natural working land strategy, there could have been no justification for engineered removal, which is the same, we're in a research arms race. So the type of research that Ted's sharing with us has also been masked for a reason. It's a whole lot easier to cut a deal with an industry that knows how to stab pipe than it is to talk to a bunch of people that are going to remind you about the white violence that created this history of inequality, whether it's water, trees, streets, you name it. Jean, I see your hand. Sorry for cutting you off.
Oh, I have just a quick question. Is that okay?
Yeah, please.
I think I don't know whether it's for Faraz or Matt, but I think one of you mentioned that the CARB plan calls for CCS on refineries and also on ethanol plants. And I didn't know that their call for CCS was about specific projects that they were going to put it on. And do they specify where they want CCS to be? And is it oil refineries and ethanol plants exclusively, or is it on anything else?
Not explicitly. So they call for lowering the carbon intensity of all sorts of fuels. So anybody that has a carbon intense fuel can get California funding money to lower its intensity. So for example, there's an ethanol plant here in Stockton that the market shut down. Nobody wanted their ethanol anymore. There's no way for it to make money without the incentives from California's low carbon fuel standard. And the people that own it are like, well, shoot, if DTE and Chevron are going to get all of this money and give it to their shareholders, we're going to get it and we're going to restore our islands and we're going to protect 25% of California's drinking water. I think that's great. I think these are really careful people that love the place where they live. But the only way for them to get that money is to have CARB pay for corn to be grown in Iowa, to dump more nitrogen into the Mississippi River Delta, to ship corn by rail through all low-income communities of color, and to then boil corn in Stockton, to invent pollution, to capture it, to float it, and then inject it. So they've created a fuel that then they can say we lowered its intensity. And so one of the evaluations that we're asking Region 9 to look at is, are you creating new pollution with this? I mean, there has to be a necessity evaluation. And the problem is the injection permit doesn't consider the necessity. It just considers the safety and the rigor of the applicant. And so I think outside of the permitting of the injection site, there's a whole world of Title VI and California government code, really legal objections that we're going to have to put out there, because all of these projects have been breaking the PM 2.5 attainment law for 25 years. And for the state of the federal government to pay to increase pollution is absolutely a crime.
Yeah, that's exactly, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, you got it. That's it. That's all I have to say.
Matt really hit it on the head. The other side too is in the electricity sector, it's not explicit, but there is a growing sense that there's going to be an application of CCS on oil, natural gas-fired power plants and gas-fired power plants. And so what we're seeing right now is that at the CCS symposium, while they did clearly explicitly say that CCS on refineries doesn't make sense, CCS on power plants seems to be a great solution. And so the concern is that we're going to see a lot of these power plants stay online, even despite the fact that they really need to be shutting down and pushing for a pathway to take them offline, especially because so many of them are concentrated in environmental justice communities, but that they're just going to stick CCS on them. And to run CCS on a power plant just requires such vast amounts of energy as well that it's really inefficient. It's deeply inefficient. The other side of it is that with refineries, we're seeing that there aren't explicit, it's not explicit exactly, but there's also a growing push for CCS in relation to hydrogen. Right now, majority of hydrogen production happens at refineries. It's part of the process through steam methane reformers, I believe. And so there is a huge push that the expectation that we're seeing is that, because it doesn't make sense, right? That you're going to see 80% of your demand from oil refineries go down, but that you're going to add this $1 billion infrastructure and continue to put them online. How does that work? And so the expectation is that they're going to be housing biofuels and hydrogen production as well.
Yep. Steve Ongerth has been waiting so long with questions and comments. Steve.
Oh, I don't mind waiting, and I want to thank every one of the speakers and Shoshana. This great presentation. A couple comments and a question. Comments. I'll start with the comments. In response to what Faraz just said, it may not be that bad because actually the Smog did a great article. Actually, I think it was The Intercept. It was Justin McCulka who used to do the Smog, saying that, you know, blue hydrogen may not actually work out in terms of the economics, and in fact, green hydrogen might overtake it. So this CCS might be a unicorn that they're chasing, so we need to keep monitor on that, and of course, make it a unicorn. The second comment I would make is, as far as getting unions involved, there is a potential opportunity coming up, and that is that although it may be a ploy for his launching of a presidential campaign, Gavin Newsom is talking about this windfall profits tax. Well, that sounds like something that union folks would be very much in support of, and to get them to support that, and you know, there's going to have to be an organization, because of course WISPA is going to use the building trades to oppose that, just as they do all this other stuff that we're talking about. But there's some of us talking about maybe getting union people organized to support it. And if that conversation happens, we can have the conversation about the CARB plans and the other things that we've been talking about. And lastly, I have a question for Matt Holmes, and that is, out in Stockton there, have you noticed any rumblings or any noise or any conversations with ILWU Local 54 about these potential developments? Because I think it's possible to preemptively get them to oppose CCS and other stuff, because I am an ILWU member, and maybe we could discuss this at an ILWU Northern California District Council, which has Local 54 delegates on it. The ILWU NCDC did support the pollen report that Ted talked about, so the conversation is happening, and there is a potential, you know, thing that could replace all that, and that's offshore wind, which the ILWU is getting involved in. So we have some organizing leverage we could use in all of these things, and I'll put my email in the chat for those of you who don't know me. I'll copy yours, Matt, and we can have this conversation.
Yeah, please do. The longshoremen out here would love to work with them more. Our Port of Stockton just realized it was a public utility and just realized it had a job to serve people locally. And I know that the longshoremen in our coalition share the opinion that a port should be used for maritime activity. Right now, we're burning grapevines for the wine industry, and we're shipping toilets for a trucking industry and taking up space at one of our 11 public ports. So would love to build common cause with them on that, and above all, the offshore wind opportunity to make our port a more meaningful port. So glad to hear you have an inroad there. Most of our conversations with the port are about the SSA, the stevedores union out there, just really not liking the electrical forklifts and whatnot for their downtime on charging. But thanks, Steve. I got your email. Look forward to reaching out and understanding more. Thanks.
Excellent. Great to hear organizers organizing themselves. This question is directed primarily to Faraz, because I know that APEN has really been at the tip of the spear in terms of organizing public response to CARB. What next after we see that plan release tomorrow, after a few days of analysis, of course? What should we be gearing up to do?
So there is the final meeting on December 15th. And I think in between then, so the expectation is that, you know, we're going to have the report for the 30 days, and then the board is going to vote to approve it. It's going to be very difficult to push and manage any major last minute changes, but there is going to be a possibility for draft resolution that we can push through the board at the same time that we're going to be they're going to be approving the scoping plan, because they're going to approve the scoping plan. And there is possibility for some changes. I think in the final, depending on what we see, I mean, what we're discussing with our partners as well is, you know, what is a best case and worst case scenario? And I think a worst case scenario is one in which we don't see much movement on the CCS piece, and the language on the phase out plan is really not adequate. And there are some rumblings and intel that we might not entirely be happy with the language on that. But again, we won't really know until we see. But we're really going to need an inside-outside strategy. I think we're really going to be preparing. We have a number of board meetings that we're continuing to do, and for, you know, folks in Sunflower Alliance, you know, sent you can still submit public comment, you can still submit emails, you can still show up to the board and give public testimony. And I think the more we can integrate inside outside strategy to really push forward, at the very least, a board resolution that really addresses some of the concerns that we have, I think that's really going to be the next phase. The other side of it is just going to be really working on implementation. At the end of the day, the scoping plan has no power until it's implemented. We can really get the ideal language that we want, but if that implementation is not led by ourselves and it's led by actors that are really not friendly to the initiatives and goals that we have for the scoping plan, it can really be derailed through different forms of interpretation. So I think we're really going to have to be plugged in. CARB is really going to have a lot of openings for implementation next year. There are a lot of rulemakings that are going to be existing, and a lot of working groups that could be assembled. And I think the more we integrate, the more we have these spaces to really strategize, we can really come around that. And yeah, that's the best answer that I have, but I think Matt might have a better answer than I.
You nailed it. There's just one other opportunity here, since all of these proposed projects are in, California sacrifice zone. California's been violating the Clean Air Act for over 25 years. CARB has allowed the Valley Air Pollution Control District to navigate permits for developers, oil and gas, and agriculture, which is why we've been DOA, and we die sometimes 10 or 13 years earlier than the rest of California. So the Clean Air Act is a big deal, and we finally have a regional administrator that really understands the difference between Central California and the coast of California, and Administrator Martha Guzman, and they issued a letter planning to reject the state implementation plan. And so CARB's going to go through a real tough set of months with finally an adult in the room from US EPA, we hope. And here we are with CARB funneling money to create new sources of pollution in an already overburdened landscape. And I think we have an opportunity to say that this is a no-go zone for investment in new pollution to comply as part of the new state implementation plan. And if we take away all the traditional oil and gas geography from the low carbon fuel standard and CCS in California, we will have put serious brakes on the TerraVault projects and the Chevron Clean Energy Ventures projects that they're trying to bury out here. Somebody brought up earlier about the co-pollutants coming out with these projects. That was actually a talking point of proponents. There were Kern County supervisors saying, yeah, we'll inject the NOx and the SOx and the CO2. We'll stick it all underground. And a significant regulator repeated that talking point to me. And I called them on their bullshit, and I directed them to the purity criteria for injection. This stuff has to be absolutely pure to be injected underground. So not only were they not thinking about co-pollutants being issued, they were barely even watching people directly misleading the public and regulators about the magical thinking of this strategy. So I don't know that everybody really understands how different it is out here in the Central Valley. I know APIN's starting to learn this and CVE's starting to learn this, but we're in a very different California. It is perfectly normal to plan for some of your residents to die a decade earlier than everyone else. And a lot of our neighbors, they think asthma is like allergies. So would love to have a little solidarity with our allies and working class communities in the first world. Appreciate y'all listening in, and showing up for public comments would be a big deal.
I just want to thank you all for these really extraordinary words. And it's really hard facilitating when you receive information like this. Honestly, I'm speechless, and yet I'm supposed to say things. I'm wondering if there are any last questions for our presenters.
I actually have a question for Matt and Faraz, whether you're thinking about the possibility that the board could actually amend the plan before adopting it, as being one of the things that it could do in the December session. So that if there's a single, like, fairly concrete, specific thing that we try to all agree on, that is pushed, that is not too complicated, that maybe we could get a majority of the board to do something. Because it's not going to be a great scoping plan, but maybe.
No. Well, it won't shock anybody here that there's only one person in California that's allowed to have an idea, and that's our Governor Gavin Newsom. But really, everybody is on the same page with that guy at every agency and on every governing board. I do think there is potential to say that to have the carbon capture scenario be narrowed to a set of necessary projects. I know it's not all a good idea, but at least if we had cement, glass, and steel proposals instead of boiling corn, burning grapevines, and washing oil and gas, that would shrink the number of wealthy and powerful people that are interested in this. And then I think the other thing that I'll be asking for vociferously is a no-go map in disadvantaged communities who have decades of advanced mortality rates and who have been left outside of the law for 25 years. So I don't like the idea of pushing this stuff out of my region into another region, because they'll head north to Sacramento. There may be a cement proposal in Redding that I'm hearing about. But I've got, urgency requires me to try to protect these folks here that are under the most pressure. So no-go map on overburdened communities is certainly possible. At least that's what some of the national labs think.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I don't think, like, theoretically it's possible to do it. I just think the political will is going to be really hard to find, especially given that if there are things that we really do not like, and if there's not movement on, it's likely going to be because of pressure from the governor. And we're trying to hold that space open at the same time, but it's going to be tough. I think the best we can do at this point is going to be, as Matt said, like some of these board resolutions. And I don't think it hurts to try, as long as we can coalesce around some really clear asks and some really clear language or amendments or board resolution. But just knowing that there's probably a ceiling to how much change we can do. Once that final plan is here, that's most likely going to be the scoping plan as it is, and that will be adopted. And maybe there are some elements, some language that we can push for, but it's going to be very, very unlikely, and it's going to have to be done with some inside strategizing before the December meeting. At the December meeting, we'll most likely be able to do board resolution at most, and there is a ceiling to that. I think Matt really got to that.
Before we hear from Martha, I just wanted to slip in Jean's comment, because it really is kind of it footnotes what you just addressed. And how did it go? Jean is asking then, should we advocate limiting CCS to cement, glass, and steel? Or I think the other suggestion was just really lifting up a couple of necessary projects, so that we're just not making one abstract refusal, but actually supporting concrete proposals.
I mean, yeah, yes, Gene, we can, and we do. And I mean, that has always been the justification from the IPCC. What are the hard to decarbonize industries that we absolutely need? And we need glass, steel, and cement. We could also have enough of a carbon budget out there if we weren't throwing so much garbage in the sky for unnecessary fossil fuel production. So, I worry about how much energy we put into helping them come up with their acrobatic trick, CCS, instead of confronting the real monster in the room, which is, people with catalytic crackers right next to our communities. So,
yeah. Martha.
Yeah, I just wanted to thank everyone. I've learned a whole lot about carbon capture and the CARB process, even though I was trying to learn it for months, but this clarified also the inside outside strategy that we need. One thing I would like for maybe a further discussion is to talk about how to defend the bills that we did pass. Our union 10-1 is the only union that came out in favor of opposing carbon capture for enhanced oil recovery. And we found out that our state council actually supported the setback legislation. It's my understanding there's a referendum already against the setback legislation. and one of the bills for rights of fast food workers that our members went in droves to Sacramento to basically push through. So at some point, I know this is a longer discussion, but I think it's an opportunity to really involve some union members in a very anti-corporate measure, along with what Steve said, is that the gouging the oil companies, the effect on workers, et cetera. So thanks, everybody. And I would like to know if anyone knows anything more about these referendums and the fight against them. Thank you.
I can tell you that I was on the CalGym call last week, and the referendum to overturn the setbacks is going to be a strong one. People like Center for Race, Poverty, and the Environment and Central Valley Air Quality Coalition have been fighting that setback fight for a decade and a half, and the Vision Coalition, and then Stand LA, of course, who you guys probably already know. And I think Vision is sort of their central organizing entity for the setback. So the Vision Coalition, I imagine, will take lead on fighting the bullshit referendum that shows that the industry has no respect for its regulator.
What I understand via Last Chance Alliance is that they actually need 1 million signatures to account for all the bad signatures that they're collecting right now. And they're going to need to do that, I think, by December 15, something like that. So it's coming to a head pretty quickly. Some bad local news, they're out in force. Apparently they've been in front of Oakland Trader Joe's. They're at the Hilltop Mall in Richmond, telling people that they should sign to lower gas prices. It behooves us to get out there, and to try to undo some of this damage as it's happening. I don't know of an organized effort yet, so if anybody has copious spare time, this might be a good direction to take. Any last comments? I'm just overwhelmed by the quality of the information, the eloquence, the passion today, and I just want to thank you guys so much for being here with us. Really invaluable. And
thank you for having
great
me.
work. Oh, our immense pleasure.
Yeah, thanks for the forum. Appreciate it.
Yeah.
Really
It'd be
appreciate it.
screaming into my pillow.
Let's do this again.
I think everyone now knows why. As I've been watching all these EJAC and CARB meetings, every time Matt Holmes speaks, it's like a triple jolt of caffeine just went through me. He really covers a lot.
I just worry that someday Janet will hear I didn't say something disciplined enough and she'll call me. So she's watching me. I'm not going to let you down, Janet.
But I can never take the notes fast enough.
Any last words?
I see 2 hands up, Shoshana. I don't know if you can see them.
Yeah. Let's, Susan, we haven't heard from you yet. And then Steve.
Hi, everybody. I also have been following the EJ meetings on Zoom, and I was very pleased that a new category in the EJ committee's responses, a new category for environmental justice was created before the second set of recommendations went. And I also went back and looked at the recommendations from March. That was about 20 pages. The new, maybe someone can put it in the chat if people want to read it. It was the new recommendations are 40 pages. So that's impressive. And I thank Matt and Faraz for their work on that, and we'll be continue to watch.
Indeed. Thanks, Susan and Steve.
Yeah, my question was, with all the election overload we've been dealing with, and I might have even forgotten whether or not these were even on the ballot this year, but were there any changes to the composition of the California State Assembly and Senate, or is that the 2024 election where that comes up? That might change the balance of power in Sacramento, like say a fossil fuel Democrat being beaten by a non-fossil fuel Democrat or vice versa?
Nothing,
I'm not hip to that. Sorry.
Nothing that's been really flagged or raised, but I do think that post-election, maybe some landscaping might be valuable.
Eddie.
Yeah, I just want to add,
sorry.
unfortunately, a very anti-fossil fuel candidate, Faiz Iqbal, Pakistani American, she ran in the South Bay of Los Angeles County, and she lost to incumbent Mike Gibson, who unfortunately has taken a lot of money from fossil fuels and buddy with petroleum and other polluting industries. But we did keep an ally, Almer Suchi, in a close contested seat in assembly in the Torrance South Bay area, a little farther west. He did one again, and he will stand up to the fossil fuel industry as he has in recent years. Despite unions trying to defeat him in re-election, he's been able to stay in office.
Any last comments?
I put the EJ recommendations, the link to it in the chat. It's not heavy text. It's more like a spreadsheet, a chart. And you can look at them. It's in various categories, including what's called the EJ category.
Before we part, I think it's really important to keep this conversation going. We haven't touched on so much, and we could have gotten even deeper into the stuff that we did touch on today. You know, we're still dealing with cap and trade. We're dealing with a huge biorefining conversion here in on the refinery corridor, which is really truly terrible. Contra Costa County sees it's tripling down on so-called renewable diesel as the crown jewel of its just transition effort. Deep sigh. We're looking at an airport expansion, possible airport expansion in Oakland. And obviously more sustainable aviation fuel production in Rodeo. What else? A lot of big stuff. And I want to thank the person who just said, I had no idea what was going on in the state. To this extent, thank you for this eye-opening meeting. Yeah, well, it's hard keeping up with it all, even if you're an activist and even if you're fairly granular with what you're granular with. There's just so much going on. So my ask to you all is to stay in touch with Sunflower Alliance. We're so busy communicating and organizing that we're not actually kind of doing the in-depth writing that we would like to be able to do. We're kind of doing a little bit of everything and always feeling like we're not doing it well enough. That said, you can always reach out to us at action@sunflower-alliance.org with suggestions, with offers of support. We could use your energy and your vision and your bright ideas. We're all a bunch of kind of self-starters. We come in with a bee in our bonnet and we follow through with support from our comrades. That's kind of how it works. We're very non-hierarchical. There's room for you. And God knows there's a lot of work to be done all the time. But if you have any ideas, any burning questions, and think that, for example, we all need to regroup in a month's time to discuss something, to learn more about, these issues so that we can actually, move smartly and strategically on them. Give us a shout, please. Let us know. And because we're all in this together. Jean?
I just wanted to put in a pitch also that if you're not subscribing to our weekly announcements newsletter, please do. You can go to the website that Shoshana said, sunflower-alliance.org, and sign up to get our weekly announcements. It's a great roundup of climate justice actions and issues in the Bay Area and beyond.
And I think that brings us to the end. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you to all of our presenters. Keep up the fantastic work. You inspire us. And yeah, much respect, much love.
Thank you.
See y'all down the trail.
Everybody.
Thank you, everyone. Keep it up. See you out there.
Be well.
Thank you.